On the quiet streets of Oak Heights, a picturesque suburban enclave, the Wilsons' residence stood as a beacon of domestic bliss to any casual observer. Zach and Betty Wilson epitomized the American dream: successful careers, a beautifully maintained craftsman-style home, and a marriage that seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. Their neighbors often noted the obvious devotion the couple had for each other, evidenced by their frequent dinners together and synchronized running sessions. However, beneath the polished veneer of their seemingly perfect life, the Wilsons harbored a secret that would ultimately lead to their downfall. For the past 2 years, Zach and Betty had been actively involved in the local swinger community, a lifestyle that promised to inject some excitement and passion into their decade-long marriage. Initially, their plunge into this world seemed to breathe new life into their relationship. They spoke of feeling closer, more honest, and more in love than ever. Yet, the reality of their chosen path was far more complex and fraught with perils than either of them could have anticipated. What began as a shared adventure in sexual exploration ultimately laid bare deep insecurities and long-buried resentments. This is a story of how a couple's quest for new experiences led to jealousy, rage, and murder. Zach Wilson was a rising star in the tech world. His sharp mind and innovative ideas quickly propelled him up the corporate ladder at a leading software development company. Colleagues described him as driven, charismatic, and occasionally intense. Tall and athletic, Zach attracted attention wherever he went. Despite his professional success, those closest to him noticed a persistent stream of insecurity stemming from a childhood marked by his parents' complicated divorce and the subsequent absence of his father. Zach and Betty were the perfect couple. Betty, a talented freelance graphic designer, balanced her husband's personality with her more relaxed and creative approach to life. With her warm eyes, infectious laughter, and the body she achieved through daily workouts, Betty was someone who easily made friends and kept them for life. Growing up in a large, noisy family, she valued connections and openness above all. The couple met in their senior year of college, and Zach immediately fell in love with Betty. While she was charmed by his ambition and hidden vulnerability. Their whirlwind romance led to an engagement by the seaside just 6 months after graduation, and they married a year later in a luxurious ceremony that became the talk of their social circle. In the first 7 years of their marriage, Zach and Betty Wilson seemed to have it all. They traveled a lot, built successful careers, and created a home that their friends envied. However, shortly thereafter, a sense of longing began to creep into their relationship. The passion that once burned so brightly had dimmed to a comfortable yet uninspiring glow. It was Betty who first raised the issue of exploring new directions in their sexual life. Being the more sexually adventurous of the two, she suggested attending a few workshops on tantric practices and BDSM. Zach, eager to please his wife and rekindle the spark in their relationship, enthusiastically agreed. These workshops opened new channels of communication between the couple, and they began discussing fantasies and desires they had never shared before. It was during one of these conversations that the topic of swinging first emerged. Betty had read about it online and was intrigued by the idea of consensual non-monogamy. Zach, initially hesitating, became interested in the concept when Betty described the prospect of deeper intimacy and shared adventures. After months of discussions, research, and self-reflection, the Wilsons decided to take a risk. They created profiles on swinger websites, attended several meet-and-greet events, and finally participated in their first full swap with another couple. This experience brought them a lot of excitement and seemed to breathe new life into their marriage. Little did they know that this decision would set off a chain of events that would ultimately lead to tragedy. The Wilsons' entry into the world of swinging began with a mix of nervous excitement and cautious optimism. Their first experience, a mild swap with a couple they met through a reputable swinger site, exceeded their expectations. The evening was filled with laughter, flirting, and a level of sexual tension that neither Zach nor Betty had felt in years. On the way home, holding hands, they couldn't suppress their smiles at each other, already planning their next encounter. Over the following months, Zach and Betty became regulars in the swinging scene. They attended parties at upscale clubs, participated in intimate gatherings at private homes, and even organized a few of their own events. Their social circle quickly expanded, filled with like-minded individuals who shared their desire for adventure and sexual experimentation. Betty, in particular, thrived in this new environment. Her natural charm and openness made her a favorite among their swing friends. She enjoyed the attention she received from both men and women, and her confidence grew. Zach also seemed to thrive. At first, he relished the sense of importance that came with receiving recognition from other women who found him attractive, and he took pride in having a wife that others desired. The couple's sex life, both with others and between themselves, reached new heights of passion and intensity. They began to experiment with fantasies they had never considered before. Betty often joked that they were having more sex now than in their first year of marriage. As they became more comfortable with this lifestyle, the Wilsons started to form deeper connections with some of the couples they met. They particularly found a rapport with Henry and Laura Sterling, a free-spirited couple. Artists who had been part of the swing scene for many years often gathered for dinner and drinks, which inevitably led to heated encounters that left everyone satisfied. However, as the months went by, subtle changes began to occur in Zach and Betty's relationship dynamic. While Betty continued to enthusiastically embrace this lifestyle, Zach started to show signs of dissatisfaction. He began to notice how other men looked at his wife, how easily she flirted and interacted with their swinging partner. What had once been a source of pride now stirred uncomfortable feelings. Zach became more vigilant about Betty's interactions, particularly with Henry. He couldn't help but notice lingering touches, inside jokes, and how Betty's eyes lit up in Henry's presence. Rational thought told him that this was all part of the game, that Betty always returned to him at the end of the night, but a nagging voice in the back of his mind whispered doubts and fueled his growing insecurities. Despite his doubts, Zach kept his feelings to himself. He didn't want to disappoint Betty or appear weak in front of their new friends. Instead, he threw himself into this lifestyle with renewed energy, as if trying to prove something to himself and to others. He initiated more meetings, proposed bolder scenarios, and pushed his boundaries further than he was actually comfortable with. Betty, caught up in the excitement and new experiences, didn't notice the subtle changes in her husband's behavior. She interpreted his increased enthusiasm as a sign that he enjoyed this lifestyle just as much as she did. In her mind, swinging had brought them closer, opening new avenues for communication and shared experiences. As their second anniversary in this lifestyle approached, the Wilson family was considered a success story in their swinging circle. They were attractive, fun, and seemed more in love than ever. But beneath the surface, seeds of discord were being sown. The very lifestyle that had infused their marriage with new energy was now silently creating a rift between them, setting the stage for tragic events that were to unfold. The first signs of trouble in what seemed to be the perfect Wilson agreement began to manifest subtly. Initially, Zach made offhand comments about scaling back their swinging activities, suggesting they focus more on their own relationship. Betty, interpreting this as a passing mood, skillfully dismissed his concerns and urged him to enjoy the freedom and excitement they had discovered. As the weeks went by, Zach's jealousy became more pronounced. He began to question Betty about her interactions with other men, particularly with Henry Sterling. His questions, once casual, grew more frequent and tense. If he used to enjoy watching Betty with other partners, now he found himself turning his eyes away, a knot tightening in his stomach. Betty, in turn, tried to understand the changes in her husband. She constantly reassured him of her love and devotion, emphasizing that their swinging adventures were purely physical and did not threaten their emotional connection. But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears as Zach's insecurity deepened. The tension between them began to spill over into their everyday life. Arguments that started over swinging quickly escalated into broader accusations and reproaches. Zach began to bring up past grievances, questioning Betty's fidelity even before they entered this lifestyle. Betty, frustrated by what she perceived as irrational behavior from Zach, began to display a defensive reaction and withdrew into herself. Their professional lives also started to suffer. Zach, usually focused on work, became distracted and irritable, and his colleagues noticed the changes, whispering about possible problems at home. Betty, for whom her job required creativity and an optimistic outlook, began to struggle increasingly with meeting deadlines and satisfying clients. Despite the growing discord, Betty did not want to give up the lifestyle that had brought her so much joy and self-discovery. She suggested taking a break from group interactions and focusing on personal meetings, hoping that this would ease Zach's jealousy. But even this compromise led to conflict when Zach accused Betty of trying to manipulate the situation for her own benefit. As their arguments intensified, the facade of the Wilsons' domestic bliss began to crumble. In a last-ditch effort to save their marriage, Zach suggested seeking the help of a specialist. Betty agreed, hoping that a professional would help them navigate the complex emotions brought on by their foray into non-monogamy. However, finding a therapist who was both qualified and unbiased towards their lifestyle proved to be difficult, adding to their frustration. As the date of the upcoming swing party organized by the Sterlings approached, the tension within the Wilson family reached a boiling point. Betty was determined to go, seeing it as an opportunity to reconnect with friends and affirm her place in the community. Zach, conflicted and feeling resentment, reluctantly agreed to attend, setting the stage for the tragic events that would unfold on May 15th. The morning was warm and clear. A perfect spring day. As twilight approached, the Wilsons began preparing for the Sterling party, an oppressive tension hanging in the air between them. Betty hummed to herself while applying her makeup, choosing a figure-hugging black dress that accentuated her curves. Zach, watching her from the doorway, felt a familiar mix of desire and fear coil in his stomach. They arrived at the Sterling's stylish loft just as the party was starting to gain momentum. The spacious apartment was bathed in soft, colorful lighting, and sultry music played from hidden speakers. Couples and singles mingled, drinks in hand, while the air was thick with anticipation and pheromones. Lara Sterling, sparkling in a gold jumpsuit, greeted them warmly. Zach couldn't help but notice how her embrace with Betty lingered, the two women exchanging knowing smiles. Henry appeared moments later, clapping Zach on the back before gently kissing Betty on the cheek. Zach began to feel increasingly uneasy as he watched Betty flit from group to group, her laughter ringing out in the room. She seemed to be in her element, radiating confidence and sexuality. On the contrary, Zach felt awkward and out of place, nursing the same drink for several hours while observing the interactions happening around him. The party began to shift directions, people started pairing off or forming small groups, disappearing into various game rooms that the Sterlings had prepared. Zach temporarily lost sight of Betty, and his anxiety surged as he began to search for her in the crowded loft. Finally, he spotted her deep in conversation with Henry, their heads leaned towards each other as they spoke in hushed tones. Unable to hold back any longer, Zach approached the pair. He caught the tail end of their conversation, something about meeting later in the week for coffee. Betty's eyes widened slightly when she noticed Zach. A flash of guilt passed over her face before she composed herself. Zach, his voice tense with barely suppressed anger, suggested that it was time to leave. Betty protested, asserting that the night was not over yet. Their disagreement, though whispered, attracted curious glances from onlookers. Henry, sensing the tension, tried to smooth things over, but his intervention seemed to only irritate Zach further, as the argument threatened to escalate into something more. Just then, Lara appeared, smoothly stepping in with practiced ease. She led Zach and Betty to a quiet corner of the loft, suggesting they take a moment to cool down. She offered them water and gentle words of advice, reminding them of the importance of open communication and mutual respect within the community. For a moment, it seemed that Lara's intervention had diffused the situation. Zach took a deep breath, clearly trying to calm himself. Betty reached out, squeezing his hand in a conciliatory gesture, but as they stood to return to the party, Zach noticed Henry watching them intently. Something in the other man's gaze, whether concern, pity, or perhaps something else, caused the thin thread of Zach's control to snap. In a cold, sharp voice, he announced that he and Betty were leaving. This time, Betty didn't argue. She saw the storm brewing in Zach's eyes and knew that their presence would only lead to conflict. Apologizing to Lara and avoiding Henry's gaze, Betty allowed Zach to lead her away from the loft. The ride home was filled with silence, the tension between them so palpable it was almost suffocating. Betty stared out the window, her previous zest for life replaced by weariness. Exhaustion gripped Zach as he held the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white, and his jaw clenched as he drove through the almost empty streets. When they pulled up to their driveway, neither of them was in a hurry to exit the car. They sat in silence for moments, not saying a word, as if unspoken words were pressing down on them. Finally, Betty turned to Zach, her voice soft yet firm as she said, "We need to talk about this. We can't go on like this." Zach nodded, his expression impenetrable in the dim light. Without a word, he exited the car and walked toward the front door. Betty followed him, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the upcoming conversation would likely change their lives forever. Neither of them could predict how prophetic that feeling would turn out to be. As soon as the front door closed behind them, the facade of calm they had maintained in public collapsed. Zach erupted at Betty. His face contorted with a mix of anger and pain. Words poured out of him in a torrent of accusations and grievances, all the doubts and fears he had accumulated over months finally finding a voice. He unleashed his fury over her behavior at the party, how she had openly flirted with Henry and others. He mentioned past meetings, analyzing them with envious attention, finding evidence of betrayal in the smallest gestures and glances. His voice rose as he spoke about the coffee plans he had overheard, convinced that it was proof of infidelity. Betty, initially shocked by Zach's outburst of rage, felt her own anger begin to rise in response to his. She vigorously defended herself, reminding him that openness and honesty had always been the foundation of their relationship and their swing lifestyle. She accused him of hypocrisy, pointing out his own enthusiastic participation in their way of life until recently. Their argument echoed through the house. Betty tried to find common ground with Zach, convincing him that his jealousy was unwarranted, but her words seemed to bounce off him, leaving no impression. In desperation, she mentioned his own escapades in the swinging community, asking why it was acceptable for him but not for her. This only further enraged Zach. He stepped closer to Betty, his tall figure looming over her as he cornered her in their living room. Betty felt trapped and increasingly fearful of Zach's unusual aggressiveness as she tried to squeeze past him. At that moment, something in Zach snapped. When Betty attempted to move away, he grabbed her by the arms, his fingers digging into her skin with force, leaving blue marks. Betty cried out in pain and shock, her eyes widening in disbelief as she looked at the man she had loved for over 10 years, now suddenly unrecognizable in his fury. She struggled against his grip, her own anger giving way to fear as she realized how uncontrollable the situation had become. Zach, lost in a fog of jealousy and rage, didn't seem to hear her pleas to let go. In her desperation to break free, Betty struck Zach in the face, her nails leaving angry red scratches on his cheek. This physical contact seemed to push Zach over the edge. With a growl of incoherent fury, he shoved Betty hard, and she stumbled back. Her heel caught on the edge of the carpet, time seemed to slow as she fell, her hands flailing in an attempt to regain her balance, but there was nothing to cushion her fall, and her head struck the corner of a massive oak table with a terrible sound. That sound seemed to snap Zach out of his madness. He stood frozen, watching in horror as Betty crumpled to the floor, a small pool of blood beginning to form under her head. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Zach's heavy breathing. For several long moments, he remained rooted to the spot, his mind grappling with the reality of what had just happened. Then, as if making his way through a maze, he stumbled towards Betty's lifeless form. He fell to his knees beside her, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch her. Her skin was still warm, but as he frantically searched for a pulse, he found nothing. The reality of the situation crashed down on Zach like a tidal wave. He had done the unthinkable. In a moment of uncontrollable rage, he had taken the life of the woman he loved. As the weight of his actions began to sink in, Zach let out a cry of anguish, cradling Betty's lifeless body in his arms as tears streamed down his face. On a quiet suburban street, a neighbor walking his dog stopped, shocked by the sound of despair emanating from the Wilsons' house. It was a cry that would haunt the neighbors for many years, marking the moment when a loving marriage came to an end, an unimaginable tragedy. The early morning calm of Oak Heights was shattered by the arrival of police patrols and an ambulance, their lights painting the street with alternating flashes of red and blue. Neighbors emerged from their homes, watching the unfolding scene with a mix of curiosity and horror. Detective Ronnie Frost, a veteran of the homicide department, arrived soon after the first responders. As she passed under the crime scene tape, she was struck by the contrast between the well-kept exterior of the Wilsons' home and the chaos awaiting inside. The living room, once a showcase of stylish decor, now bore unmistakable signs of violence. The coffee table was askew, a lamp lay shattered on the floor, and in the center of it all lay Betty Wilson's body, partially covered by a sheet. Forensic investigators moved about the room with practiced efficiency, photographing and collecting evidence. Frost's keen eyes took note of every detail. Dr. Kai Nakamura informed her of their initial findings. The cause of death appeared to be blunt force trauma to the head, likely from a blow to the edge of the coffee table. Signs of a struggle were evident, including bruises on the victim's arms and defensive wounds on her fingers. As Nakamura spoke, Frost's attention was drawn to the figure of Zach Wilson sitting in a chair in the dining room, his head in his hands, still wearing the clothes from the previous evening. The evening party now felt disheveled and stained as an officer in uniform stood watch over the distraught husband. Frost approached Zach, her experienced gaze noting his bruised cheek and the bloodstains on his shirt, and with a voice choked by tears, he began recounting the story of the party. Listening to him, Frost's instincts told her that there was something more to the story than Zach revealed. His account seemed rehearsed, lacking the genuine emotion one would expect from a man who had just lost his wife. She made a mental note to dig deeper into the couple's past and their recent actions. Neighbors huddled in small groups, exchanging shocked whispers and bewildered glances. The Wilsons always appeared so happy, so perfect. What could have gone so terribly wrong? In the days following Betty's death, Detective Frost and her team worked tirelessly to piece together the events that led to that fateful night. Their investigation began to uncover a complex web of relationships and hidden tensions lying beneath the surface of the seemingly idyllic lives of the Wilsons. Interviews with friends and colleagues painted a picture of a couple that had recently adopted a swinging lifestyle. While many expressed surprise at this news, a select few provided valuable insights into the dynamics of the Wilsons' open marriage. Laura Sterling, in particular, emerged as a key witness, recounting a quarrel she witnessed at a party in the evident tension between Zach and Betty. As the detectives delved deeper into their investigation, they uncovered a trail of digital evidence that illuminated the couple's private life. Text messages and emails revealed Zach's growing anxieties and Betty's increasing dissatisfaction with his behavior. Particularly damning were a series of exchanges between Betty and Henry Sterling discussing Zach's recent mood swings and Betty's concerns about the future of her marriage. Forensic analysis of the crime scene provided even more incriminating evidence against Zach. The angle and force of Betty's fatal injury were inconsistent with a simple fall. DNA found under Betty's nails matched Zach's, confirming signs of a struggle. Moreover, toxicology reports showed that while Betty had a moderate amount of alcohol in her system, Zach's blood alcohol level was significantly higher, suggesting that he may have been more impaired than he initially claimed. As the investigation continued, Detective Frost subjected Zach to a series of intense interrogations. Under the relentless pressure of questioning, his carefully constructed lies began to unravel. Discrepancies in his story emerged, and his demeanor shifted from that of a grieving widower to a man consumed by guilt and fear. In a dramatic turn of events, Henry Sterling provided additional information, he reported that Betty had confided in him about her plans to leave Zach, citing his increasingly controlling and jealous behavior. This revelation provided a possible motive for Zach's actions, suggesting that the murder might have been premeditated rather than a spontaneous crime of passion. During the investigation, financial records were discovered indicating that Zach had recently shown interest in a life insurance policy for the couple, adding another layer of suspicion to his behavior. Friends reported that he was under growing stress at work, as rumors of potential layoffs circulated in his company. With the mounting evidence, the prosecution began to build a serious case against Zach Wilson. The narrative that emerged described a man who, faced with the likelihood of losing both his wife and the carefully crafted image of success, descended into a jealous rage with tragic consequences. Preparations for the trial aimed to capture the attention of the city and beyond, promising to unveil the hidden world of suburban swingers and the devastating effects of unchecked jealousy. Prosecutor Vivian Shao opened the proceedings with a powerful statement, painting a vivid picture of a marriage shattered by jealousy and a woman's life tragically cut short. She promised to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Zach Wilson killed his wife in a fit of rage fueled by his inability to control her and the fear of losing her. The defense, on the other hand, presented a narrative of a tragic accident stemming from a love that had been strained by a lifestyle neither party was fully prepared for. Holloway sought to portray Zach as a devoted husband caught under pressure from circumstances beyond his control. As the trial progressed, a number of witnesses took the stand. Laura and Henry Sterling provided key testimony about the Wilsons' connections to the swinging community and the visible tension between them on the night of Betty's death. Their testimonies were both enlightening and scandalous, causing a stir in the courtroom and generating sensational headlines. Forensic experts presented detailed analyses of the crime scene, and Dr. Kai Nakamura provided devastating evidence about the nature of Betty's injuries. His assertion that the fatal wound was inconsistent with an accident dealt a significant blow to the defense's case. Perhaps the most dramatic moment of the trial came when Zach Wilson himself took the stand. Under the careful guidance of his attorney, he presented himself as a man deeply in love with his wife who had agreed to explore swinging to satisfy her. He spoke about the growing discomfort with his lifestyle and his fears of losing Betty. However, under the relentless cross-examination, the carefully constructed facade of Zach began to crumble. She confronted him with text messages, emails, and witness testimonies that contradicted his version of events. As the interrogation intensified, Zach's composure started to break down, revealing flashes of anger and jealousy that led to that fateful night. The courtroom watched with rapt attention as Zach struggled to maintain his story under the pressure of the accusations. His voice trembled as he recalled the last argument with Betty, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might give in and confess. But he managed to hold on, sticking to his account of a tragic accident until the very end. As the trial neared its conclusion, both the prosecution and the defense delivered passionate closing statements. Joe urged the jurors to see the lies of Zach and hold him accountable for the brutal act that ended Betty's life. Holloway, in turn, pleaded for understanding, asking the jurors to consider the complex emotions and circumstances that led to this tragedy. With all the evidence and arguments presented, the case was handed over to the jury. When they stepped out to begin their deliberations, a tense silence fell over the courtroom. Zach Wilson's fate now rested in their hands. Ultimately, the jury took less than 6 hours to render a verdict. Zach Wilson was found guilty of second-degree murder, a decision that shocked the community and brought some measure of closure to the grieving family and friends of Betty. The judge, citing the brutal nature of the crime and Zach's lack of remorse, sentenced him to 25 years in prison with the possibility of concurrent sentencing. The aftermath of the trial left an indelible mark on the community. The case exposed a hidden world of suburban swingers, sparking lively debates about morality, trust, and the nature of modern relationships. Some couples who were part of this lifestyle quietly distanced themselves, while others became active proponents of ethical non-monogamy, emphasizing the importance of communication and consent. Ultimately, the tragic story of Zach and Betty Wilson served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the strongest relationships can be shattered by jealousy, mistrust, and uncontrolled rage. Their story will be remembered not only as a sensational crime but also as a complex human tragedy born of the eternal struggle between love, desire, and the need for control.